The street was alive with movement, the sounds of busy life echoing in every direction. People hurried past the small shops, some stopping to chat, others lost in their own thoughts. It was a typical afternoon in this bustling part of town, loud, fast, and always in a rush. Among the crowd, there was an elderly man, his pace slow and deliberate. His hair was white, his back a little hunched, and his face was marked with the soft lines of age. He gripped a cane with both hands, using it to steady himself as he walked carefully along the sidewalk. A small bag of groceries hung from his arm, the contents rattling softly with each step. He wore a faded jacket and trousers that had seen better days, but everything was neat, and he moved with a quiet dignity. On the corner, a group of young men loitered. They were loud, their laughter bouncing off the nearby buildings. They wore oversized jackets and hats pulled low, their eyes darting around the street, scanning for trouble. They spoke in rough tones, the kind that made the people nearby avoid eye contact. The gang was known around these parts, and they didn't always have the best reputation. The elderly man walked past them, unaware of the trouble that was about to unfold. The elderly man moved down the street, with steady, careful steps. His cane tapped lightly on the pavement, a rhythmic sound that echoed in the quiet moments between the chaos of the city. He wasn't in any hurry, he had nowhere to be, just going about his usual routine. The world around him seemed to blur as he focused on his path. His eyes, though tired, were clear, and his face held the kind of peaceful expression only time could bring. As he walked, he glanced at the small shops along the way, his gaze lingering on a bakery window filled with fresh bread. He'd always enjoyed the smell of bread, though he rarely bought any anymore. His pension didn't stretch that far, and these days he made do with the simple things: bread from the discount store, a few cans of soup, and the occasional treat for himself. His steps were slow but sure, a quiet rhythm against the noise of the world around him. He passed by a young mother with her child, who smiled at him, but he didn't notice. His focus was on his next step, on the weight of his bag in his hand, on the slight ache in his joints. It was a familiar discomfort, one he'd learned to live with over the years. He didn't complain, didn't ask for help. He was used to it. The gang on the corner had noticed him by now, their eyes flickered over to him, sizing him up as they exchanged a few quiet words. He wasn't a threat, just an old man walking down the street, but in their eyes, that might be enough to make him a target. As the elderly man walked past, one of the gang members, tall with a dark hoodie pulled over his head, nudged the one next to him and nodded toward the old man. "Hey, look at this guy," he said, his voice loud enough for the man to hear. "Out here alone, all slow and weak." He laughed, his friends joining in. The elderly man didn't flinch, his eyes focused ahead as he continued his slow, steady pace. He heard the comment, of course, but he refused to acknowledge it. It was just words, but the gang wasn't letting it go. Another member, shorter with a gold chain hanging from his neck, chimed in. "Hey Grandpa, you need a hand, or are you just gonna fall over any minute?" The laughter grew louder, a harsh, grating sound that seemed to fill the air around the elderly man. His grip tightened on his cane, but he kept walking, trying to ignore them. His heart beat a little faster, but he wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing him react. He had seen this kind of thing before, kids making fun of the elderly, thinking it was funny, but this felt different. The taunts were more deliberate, more cruel. A couple of passers-by glanced in his direction, their faces tightening at the sound of the insults. But they quickly turned their heads, walking past without saying a word. No one wanted to get involved. The elderly man was alone, both in the street and in this moment. The gang wasn't done. They gathered around the elderly man now, their voices louder, more taunting. One of them, the largest of the group, stepped forward. He grinned, a nasty mocking smile that stretched across his face. "You're a real piece of work, old man," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "What are you doing out here?" "Taking a stroll to the cemetery." The others laughed, a few of them even hooting in amusement. The elderly man tried to keep his eyes ahead, but the sting of their words was sharp. His face flushed a little, though he didn't look at them. One of the gang members, the one who had called him Grandpa, grabbed the bag of groceries from the elderly man's arm and yanked it away. "What's in here, huh? More old man food," he sneered, tossing the bag up and down in his hand. The elderly man instinctively reached for it, but the gang member held it just out of his reach. "Give it back," the elderly man said, his voice softer than he intended, his hands shaking slightly. The gang member ignored him, tossing the bag back and forth like a toy. "What's the matter, huh? You can't even stand up for yourself," he mocked. "Maybe it's time you just stayed home where you belong." The elderly man's grip tightened on his cane, but he didn't speak. The weight of the insults pressed on him, each word a sharp reminder of his age, of how alone he was in the world. People walked by, casting quick glances in his direction, but no one stopped. No one intervened. The street felt smaller, quieter, as the gang's laughter echoed around him. The scene was growing more tense by the second, the gang's laughter echoing through the street. The elderly man's face was flushed, his hands trembling with frustration, but he didn't fight back. He just stood there staring at his feet, trying to ignore the cruel words. The bag of groceries dangled uselessly in the air, out of his reach. But just then, a figure appeared at the edge of the crowd. A man, walking toward them with a calm, steady stride. His clothes were different from the usual crowd that roamed the streets. He wore a well-tailored coat, a crisp shirt, and polished shoes that clicked against the pavement as he walked. He didn't seem to fit in here, not in this part of town. His presence was out of place, but it was the kind of out of place that commanded attention. The gang didn't notice him at first. They were too wrapped up in their teasing, too busy mocking the elderly man, but as the figure moved closer, the laughter began to die down. The stranger didn't hurry, didn't rush. He walked with purpose, his eyes fixed ahead. It wasn't until he was a few steps away that one of the gang members glanced up. The change in the air was immediate. The laughter stopped, the tension rising as the stranger's calm presence reached them. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, watching the gang with an almost unsettling stillness. The silence seemed to stretch between them, and the gang, for the first time, felt a flicker of uncertainty. The elderly man's eyes, still downcast, didn't notice the stranger yet. He was too focused on the ground, on the weight of his bag, on the growing ache in his chest. The stranger stood there for a moment, his gaze unwavering, studying the gang as they shifted uncomfortably. His silence made them uneasy, as if he was watching them, calculating their every move. He didn't flinch, didn't speak, but his presence alone made the gang hesitate. Finally, the largest member of the group, the one who had mocked the elderly man earlier, spoke up. "What's your problem, man?" he sneered, stepping forward, trying to assert his dominance. "You got something to say?" The stranger's eyes remained cold, steady, not a hint of fear or aggression in them. "Leave him alone," he said, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the air like a sharp blade. The gang members paused, taken aback by the stranger's calmness. Most people would have backed off, or made excuses when faced with them. But this man stood tall, not a hint of fear on his face. His words were simple, direct, but they carried weight. "You think we should just walk away?" One of the gang members, the one who had grabbed the elderly man's bag, asked with a sneer. "What if we don't want to?" The stranger didn't blink, didn't waver. "Then I'll make you," he replied, his voice still calm, but now there was an edge to it, a quiet authority that made the gang uneasy. The gang exchanged uncertain looks, the laughter from moments ago dying in the air. One of them, a smaller guy, took a step back, clearly uncomfortable with how the situation was shifting. The stranger didn't raise his voice, didn't move toward them aggressively. He simply stood his ground. The elderly man, still standing with his cane, glanced up for the first time. His eyes caught the stranger's figure in the distance, and something in him stirred. Was it hope? Or was it just a momentary distraction from the cruelty that had been directed at him? The gang was starting to feel the pressure. They'd grown used to getting their way, to bullying anyone weaker than them, without fear of consequences. But the stranger wasn't like anyone they'd encountered before. He didn't back down. "Who do you think you are, huh?" the largest gang member barked, stepping closer to the stranger, his fists clenched. You think you can just tell us what to do? The stranger's gaze never wavered, his posture was relaxed, but there was something about him, something in the way he stood that made the gang nervous. He wasn't flustered, wasn't intimidated, it was as if he had dealt with this kind of thing before, countless times. One of the younger gang members, a wiry guy with a bandana, sneered. You think you're tough, old man, he mocked. You want to make us stop, why don't you prove it? The stranger didn't respond with anger or threats, instead, he took a slow step forward, closing the space between them, his eyes locked onto the bandana-wearing guy. The rest of the gang watched, their eyes flicking between each other, unsure of how to react. This wasn't how things usually went. Get out of our way, the bandana-wearing guy spat, shoving the stranger with one hand, but the stranger didn't move an inch. His gaze never shifted from the young man's eyes, and he didn't raise his voice. It was as though the stranger wasn't even in the same world as the gang. His calm was a contrast to their chaos, and it made them falter. The large man who had been the most aggressive earlier, took a step back, glancing around, his confidence starting to crumble. The stranger, without a word, had made them question their next move. The moment stretched on, thick with tension. The gang members shifted nervously, their cocky attitudes starting to falter. They weren't used to this feeling, the feeling of someone standing up to them without backing down, without fear. The stranger's presence was overpowering in its stillness, and it was slowly becoming clear that they weren't going to get what they expected, a quick fight, a quick win, and a show of power. The largest gang member, the one who had first stepped forward, scowled, his fists still clenched at his sides. You really think you can stop us? He growled, his voice was tinged with anger now, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. But even his anger seemed to lack the usual conviction. He didn't know what to do with a person who wasn't afraid of him. The bandana-wearing gang member, who had shoved the stranger earlier, was the first to speak again. We don't need to listen to you, he spat, his voice full of defiance. You can't just tell us what to do. Will, but before he could finish his sentence, the stranger took one more step forward, and that's when it happened. The gang members froze, without lifting a finger. The stranger simply raised an eyebrow, his gaze unshifting, and for a split second, the gang members felt something strange. It wasn't fear, exactly, but a sense of unease, a feeling that maybe they were out of their depth. They had been brash, cruel, throwing their weight around for so long, but now, standing before this man, they felt small. In the silence, the stranger's calm power felt almost overwhelming. For a brief moment, the street seemed to hold its breath. The largest gang member took a step back, his confidence cracking. He glanced at his friends, as if silently asking for confirmation. The others didn't meet his gaze. Their eyes were fixed on the ground, on their shoes, anywhere but at the stranger who had put them in their place with nothing more than his presence. The bandana-wearing guy swallowed hard and muttered something under his breath. The words were unclear, but the meaning was obvious. They were done. Slowly, reluctantly, the gang began to disperse. The large guy, still fuming, shot one last glare at the stranger, but there was no fight left in him. The group shuffled away, their heads down, leaving the elderly man and the stranger in peace. The elderly man stood there, his cane still gripped tightly in his hands, watching the gang retreat. For a moment, he was unsure whether what had just happened was real. Had he just been saved by this mysterious figure, or had the gang finally decided to leave him alone on their own? But it didn't matter, the important thing was that they were gone. The stranger turned to leave without saying another word. He didn't look back, didn't wait for thanks. His footsteps echoed softly in the street, as he moved away, blending into the crowd, as if he were just another passerby. The elderly man blinked, unsure of what had just happened. His heart still raced, but now it was from relief rather than fear. He glanced down at the ground, and saw his bag of groceries, still intact, resting on the pavement. For the first time in what felt like hours, the world around him seemed a little quieter, a little safer. The stranger didn't look back, his figure melted into the crowd, as if he were just another person going about his day. No one seemed to notice him leave. He wasn't a hero, not in the eyes of the world. He was just a man who'd done what was right, and then faded into the background, where he belonged. The elderly man stood there, watching him go, feeling a strange mixture of gratitude and confusion. He hadn't asked for help, hadn't expected anything. Yet here was someone, a complete stranger, who had stepped in when no one else would. He glanced down at his groceries, still lying on the pavement, and bent down slowly to pick them up. His hands were shaking, but not from fear anymore. The weight of the moment pressed on him. He had been humiliated, threatened, and insulted, but somehow, in the end he was okay. He wasn't sure how it had happened, but the fear that had gripped him earlier had melted away. The gang was gone, and the street felt normal again. The elderly man straightened up, holding the bag tightly in his hands. He turned to look at the spot where the stranger had disappeared, but the crowd had already swallowed him up. It was like he had never been there at all. He took a deep breath, feeling the air in his lungs a little more clearly. For the first time in a while, he felt a spark of hope, a reminder that even in the harshest moments, there were still people who cared enough to help.